So chapter four, we're going to be looking at the human population and human population growth over time, the different factors that affect it, the different consequences population growth has in terms of the growing human population globally. And we've talked about some of these factors a little bit when we're looking at just population growth in general in the last chapter, but now we will be focusing specifically on us. So to start, we've just got a graph showing the human population over time, and you can see going back about 250 years, you can see it was less than a billion, or less than a billion, excuse me, up until about 1800, and it stayed pretty flat for the most part, all the way up until about 1900, early 1900s, and then we started to see a pretty sizable spike around 1920s. This is going to correspond, of course, with the Industrial Revolution a bit. We were able to start really producing things, getting more resources, getting more food, and the population started to grow accordingly. And we can see the population is still expected to grow. Currently, depending on where you look, this graph's a little bit old from 2015. We're up near 8 billion now. And depending on where you look, the projections can vary from actually increasing and then dropping off a bit to projecting to even much larger than the 11.2 that they have here. And one of the reasons it's difficult to actually make that projection and make it with confidence is just so many of the different factors are going to be unknowns, and we're going to go through those factors, like I said. But before we even do that, I just want to point out that the population growth we're showing here is globally. So it's for the entire world, but depending on where you're located, depending on what country you're looking at, the population growth can look much different than what we're seeing here as a whole. So some countries are going to be currently growing at very fast rates. Other countries are actually going to have the population decreasing a bit. So it's going to be dependent on that specific country. And again, right now we're just looking at the global population as a whole. And even though the population is increasing and is expected to increase, as we're showing in the two blue colors here, you can see that the population rate, or at least the rate at which it has been increasing, has started to slow. So it is still positive. And it's projected to stay positive through the rest of the century at least. But you can see that rate's decreasing. That's why we start to see, at least in this projection, we start to see the slope drop down a little bit. Because again, the blue is the actual population, or the projected, depending on where we are, and then this red line is the growth rate. So anywhere from 0 to about 2%, depending on the particular time. And then, like I said, the population itself is going to have a lot of impacts. So we want to think about, what does this increasing population mean? What has it already meant? And what does it mean going forward? Will we deplete resources? Like I said, is this already happening? Will it occur going forward? One thing a lot of people say in terms of a lot of the different problems that we're facing as a society is that eventually technology, eventually human ingenuity is going to solve those issues. And to some degree, that may be true. It's tough to say, and it's also tough to kind of just bank on somebody coming up with a solution someday. So we do want to think about what these problems are, how we can address them now, and how we can have plans going forward into the future. Oops. Excuse me. And then also somewhat related to this, it's going to be some ethical questions, some societal questions, because what we're seeing is the birth rates are currently highest in poorest countries and in the poorest areas. So we want to think about, how will this impact everybody? And then we also want to think about, what are the best, most fair ways to manage population growth? Because again, this is going to be dependent on where you are, depending on what country you're in. And it's not really, at least I wouldn't say it's really fair for a country like the United States that uses so many resources to go to another country and try to say, obviously it wouldn't actually work, but to say like, hey, this is how the population should grow, and try to put in plans for how other countries should operate. So there's always going to be some sort of conflict, in the sense that there's no really way to impose any sort of guidelines for this, because it's going to be something that's extremely personal for people, and it's going to be dependent on the society that they're in. And we're going to go through some of those as we go through the chapter. Another factor to think about in terms of the growing population, in addition to just resources in general, is food. And the big question, is there enough food? Will there be enough food going forward? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. Currently, there is plenty of food, and I would suspect that going forward, there will remain plenty of food in terms of the sense of how many calories are available globally per person per day. So if we look at the two bullet points in the middle here, in the 1970s, it was estimated that enough food was produced for every person on the planet to get about 2,400 calories per day. And in 2015, despite the population nearly doubling from 3.7 to 7 billion, the amount of food on the planet, or at least the amount of calories available, increased to a production of 3,100 calories per person per day. The issue with this, though, isn't going to be the production of the food. It's going to be more related to the distribution and sort of the politics and the economics related to that. As we talked about briefly in chapter 1, where we were kind of looking at just some of the general topics we were going to cover throughout the quarter, we talked about how poor countries get less of a share of the resources. Richer countries like the United States, like the countries in Europe, tend to use a greater share of resources. And again, this includes food, and unfortunately includes a large amount of that food going to waste. And we will look at food production specifically in chapter, I want to say 7. But related to the food consumption, we also have to think about the ecological footprint. So obviously, as we have more people, that's going to use up more resources. But like I was talking about with the use of resources in the United States and in Europe, much larger than in other parts of the planet. So we need to think about our resource allocation, our resource use, in addition to just the population growth in general. Because if we look at the average US resident, it takes almost 10 hectares to support the land for each person. Whereas in Malawi, so if you're not familiar with where that is, in eastern, sort of southeastern Africa, the average resident uses half a hectare or would need half a hectare to sort of support the way that they live, the amount of resources that they use. So just the increase in population in general is going to obviously involve an increase in resources, but we also need to think about how we're using those resources. The average US resident right now is using about 20 times as much as the average Malawian. So again, we could still have a much larger population, but if everybody's using less resources, going to be less of an issue. So it's going to be sort of a factor of those two. But when we're thinking about growth, there's going to be factors that influence recently. Over the past couple of years, we've seen epidemics of the pandemic, COVID, obviously widespread disease, can impact the population. And then even sort of somewhat extended from that, the way people live during a pandemic may have some sort of influence on growth, because with that, there's going to be societal factors like economic and political ones related to that. We've seen, especially at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, a lot of people lost their jobs. So when people are in financial hardships, that's going to impact their ability or their desire to have kids. That's going to ultimately impact the population. And then we'll also see just things like fertility rates, infant mortality, life expectancy, obviously going to play a role in the population, because that's determining just explicitly how many people are being born and how often and when they're dying. So obviously that's going to be a factor, but we'll mostly look at that from the perspective of richer countries compared to poorer countries. And with that, we've kind of got these two different two different worlds where we're looking at poorer countries, which are seeing massive increases in general in terms of their population. So for example, Nigeria, in 2010, so about a decade ago, had a population of under 200 million, so 189. And in about 40 years, so 2050, it's projected to increase by over 100 million up to just under 300 million in total. So that's a massive increase. And we're seeing similar things like that in a lot of less affluent countries. And in the richer countries, we're seeing population is more or less stable. In some cases, we're actually seeing slight decreases. Places like Japan, Russia are expected to have decreasing populations going forward. So we've kind of got these two different sort of scenarios going on depending on the level of wealth in that country. And with that, that can be from a variety of different reasons. In some cases, there may be less contraceptive available in some countries. They may need a larger workforce. The infant mortality rate may be higher, whatever it's going to be. But there's going to be differences, and we're going to cover some of these as we go. But like I said, the total fertility rate, or actually I didn't say this, I was talking about infant mortality, but total fertility rate is just going to be referring to the number of children per woman in the world. And we've got it kind of broken down here by the changes over time from about 1950, projected going forward about 30 years. And it's also split up into the different regions of the world. And you can see in general, no matter where you are, we're pretty much seeing a decrease over the past 60 years, 70 years, whatever it is. But again, you can see we don't have quite the same level in all of these different spots. We're seeing what is generally referred to as more industrial places, so like Europe has the lower fertility rates. Sub-Saharan Africa, one of the poorer locations on Earth, has the highest fertility rate. And again, that could be for workforce, could be for a whole variety of reasons, but this is going to be one of the reasons we're seeing such fast growth in places like Nigeria, because they're going to have much larger, much higher fertility rates compared to some Asian countries, some European countries, the United States, for example. And in general, this has been due to, at least the decreases in general have been due to technology. So we've got advances in medical technology that's decreased infant mortality in general. The workforce, there's less need for like farms to have as many kids because there's better technology to work those places. And like now it's not really an option for kids to just be a workforce, at least in the United States. And then in addition to that, I would also say that in a lot of places, obviously not everywhere, and it's far from perfect. But as we've gone on in time, generally, I would say that women have been offered more opportunity in the workforce and things like that. So it may also be just a slight change in terms of that as well. And then also generally the middle class, at least in America, kind of shrinking. So it's a little harder to have kids, get more expensive. So I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing the fertility rate continue to decrease. But again, there's a whole bunch of different reasons that are going to kind of factor into this. And there's one thing known as zero population growth. So this is going to be when the, as it suggests, zero population growth, number of deaths equal the number of births plus immigration. So we're going to see a constant population in this case. But many places now are going to be below that population or zero population growth, because we can see 2.1 considered the replacement rate, where we would actually kind of be at that. And we can see at least a couple areas here are dipping below even 2.0. So we're a little behind the replacement rate in some places, which isn't necessarily bad or good. going to be kind of dependent on that situation. But with the population growth, one of the reasons we're seeing it increase so much is just people are living longer. If you look for a lot of time, people were living to 35 to 45, and then we got to about 1870 maybe, and then we saw it increase in a lot of places, got to 1900, saw it increase everywhere else. So it makes sense that we're seeing an increase in population because we're just having people live for, in some cases, nearly twice as long. And again, this is going to be due to those same reasons that the fertility rate may be decreasing. There's just better technology, better medicine, cleaner environments in terms of the drinking water, even though there are pollutants being added to the environment constantly. We do monitor things like that a little bit better in general. And with this longer life expectancy, in addition to just the increased population due to the increased lifespan, that's also affecting the societal relations we have, in the sense that there's more elderly people, especially elderly people who are unable to work. And that affects sort of just how people are able to plan their lives and the jobs they're going to have. So that's going to have economic consequences, in addition to just the increased resource usage from longer lives. And it's also going to lead to different situations in terms of the population growth going forward if we've got a larger proportion of elderly people. So if we look at this graph here, this is for Afghanistan a few years back. And what we're showing is on the left, the population of males, on the right, population of females, and then we've got it broken down by age, starting with 0 to 4 at the bottom, all the way to 100 plus at the very top. And in this case, we can see that each side of this graph is much, much larger at the bottom, and then it's kind of getting squeezed down as we move further along, as we get into those higher age groups. So this is going to be an example of a country that's going to be experiencing rapid growth. Because if we think about it, as this population ages, it's got a large amount of children and pre-adolescent people, young adults even, that are then going to move into full-blown adulthood. They're going to have families of their own, and we're going to see an increased population. We're going to see an increase in the birth rate. But since we've got so few elderly people, the mortality rate is going to be much lower than that birth rate. So we're going to see the population increase. So this is what we would kind of see for a country where we're expecting rapid population growth. Now, when we look at Sweden, basically the same type of graph, just slightly different format. But again, young ages at the bottom, higher ages at the top. We've got it split by male and female. And in this case, we can see it's more or less pretty even throughout these different age groups until we get to the very old, which is just where it's going to start, where we start getting above 80. We start to see some of these groups get much, much smaller. But from 0 to about 70 something, there's not a ton of difference between these. It's a more stable population. That's why we would expect the population to stay relatively the same, because as these populations, as these age groups age, since they're all relatively the same size, there's not going to be a large birth rate, or an relatively large birth rate. There's not going to be an extremely large mortality rate as well. So we're going to see the population more or less stay constant in situations like we have here with Sweden. And then just to look at more examples, these ones are just in general. Again, larger bases are going to be extremely rapidly growing because they've got that younger population that are going to ultimately be producing more children without a lot of old people. This one here is like what we saw with Sweden. And then we've kind of got in between the two. We don't have quite as large of a base at the bottom. We don't have quite as thin of a elderly population at the top. So this is going to be a slowly growing country. So this is going to be places like the United States, as well as Australia and China. And then what we have here where it's similar to what we saw with Sweden. It's more or less the same throughout, but it's actually a little thinner at the bottom. Doesn't have quite as many of those young people. Little thicker at the top in terms of the elderly population. This is going to be where we start to see the population actually decrease. This is going to be places like Russia, and then they've also got Germany and Bulgaria listed here. I would also think that Japan may actually be in this group as well, but I don't know exactly how old this graph is, and I don't know, I'm not totally familiar with the Japanese population growth, but at least when I last checked, Japan did have a declining population, or at least was expected to have a declining population. And with this population growth, there's going to be many factors. So we've talked about sort of what the result of population growth can be in terms of food and resources availability. But there's also going to be cultural influences coming from the society that people live in terms of the sort of a push to have kids or not, depending on exactly where you are. So in terms of pronatalist pressures, what that's referring to is just reasons that some people may feel the need to have children. So this is going to obviously impact the growth rate, because it's going to impact whether or not people decide to have kids. And we can see a whole bunch, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but we can see a few of the reasons here. Some people just want to have a family. Some people view children kind of as a workforce to some degree. Some people think of it kind of as a replacement of the members of society that are either dying off or going to no longer be able to be part of that workforce. So those two are kind of related. In some cases, having children can increase your societal status. Some people, if they've already had one kid and it was a boy or a girl, may want to try for the other. Some people may just want to not have an only child for whatever reason. Male pride, I think, is just, I honestly can't even remember why I put that on there, but I think it's just some people think having a lot of kids, I don't know. But whatever the reason are, there's going to be a ton of different factors that may sort of push people into having kids. And then, like I said, that's going to ultimately impact the growth rate. And depending on what country you're in, depending on the exact sort of population dynamics, depending on the resource availability, the government of those places may actually develop what are called pro or anti-natalist policies to either kind of try to promote and incentivize having children if they want a pro-natalist policy, or just the opposite if they want anti-natalist. So something that's going to hopefully slow the growth of population and allow for the maintaining of resource availability for the entire population, and especially going forward. So with the anti-natalist policies, some of those may be familiar with things like the one-child policy in China. And then there's kind of the reverse things in some places. Like I think France at one point outlawed contraceptives to try to increase the population. So depending on where you are, depending on, like I said, the resources available, depending on the current population, the workforce, whatever it may be, that country is going to incentivize, or it's going to incentivize having kids or not having kids. So in that can include things like offering tax breaks for childbirth and things like that, if they want to incentivize having kids. Or it could be things like the one-child policy, like I mentioned, if they want to go the opposite direction. I should mention with this, natalist policy can include things like abortion, but abortion and natalist policy are not the same thing. So this natalist policy is sort of from the perspective of promoting or promoting having kids or not, whereas abortion is the decision to terminate a pregnancy or not. Two very different things. They certainly can be related. If a country wanted to be super pro-natalist, I guess they could outlaw abortion. I always think that's kind of crazy because whether you believe like support it or not, people are going to get them anyway. So if you outlaw them, women are just going to wind up, especially poor women, are just going to wind up dying. But uh, not abortion and natalism are not exactly the same thing. And then, in addition to just the policies that the country can set as sort of like a government, the factors of that society are of course going to play a role. So in terms of education and income, we've seen more opportunities for women in general. Obviously, again, like I've said, not perfect. At least in the United States, we've seen more opportunities for women. So that may explain a decrease in the fertility rate. We've also seen an increase in the cost of having a kid, the cost of childcare, things like that. So people may be deciding not to have kids just because they simply can't afford it. And then in addition to the choice, the individual kind of choice, or I guess it's kind of individual in that sense. But as a society as a whole, things like wars often impact birth rates. So we saw after World War II, the baby boom. And then where you may expect in the 80s, when the children of the baby boom would likely have their own kids, where you may have expected a similar baby boom. But since it was a less economically fruitful time in the 80s compared to the original baby boom, there was only what's known as an echo boom. So not quite as large of a time of birth rates and things like that. Because again, economic factors are always going to play a role. And finally, what we're going to look at is just sort of the way in which the population kind of adjusts in general. And with this, we're going to be breaking it into four stages. So the first stage we've got, if you look, we've got kind of a bluish purple maybe line, and then we're representing the death rate. We've got a pink one representing the birth rate, and then we've got the red one just representing the total population. So in this first stage, we can see the birth rate and the death rate are both relatively high, and they're both pretty much even. They go back and forth. And that's why we're seeing in this first stage, the population's kept constant and it's kept at a low level, because at this time, we're not seeing, I mean, even though we are seeing a lot of births, we're also seeing a lot of deaths to kind of balance that out. So we're not seeing much change overall. But then we go to the second stage, whoops, and I'm out of order here. The second stage, we start to see a decrease in death rates, and this could be due to the medical advances we talked about, better sanitation, just whatever it's going to be that ultimately decrease that death rate, better food production, maybe more nutritious food, for example. So we're going to see that death rate decrease. But initially, nothing's going to really change about that birth rate, because people are still going to be, they're not going to really notice that death rate decreasing initially. So there's not going to be anything that they're going to be doing that's going to alter the birth rate accordingly. So in stage 2, we see that death rate plummet. We see the birth rate remain constant though. So since we're having much more births than we are deaths, that's why we start to see the population increase. And in stage 3, we're still seeing the same thing in general, but now there's been a couple generations maybe since that death rate really started to plummet. So people have started to adjust to the new situations. They don't need to reproduce as often. They don't need as many kids. Maybe the infant mortality rate has decreased. So you don't need to have as many kids. And that's why we start to see in the third stage, the birth rate typically decreases as well. Death rate continues to go down. So we're still with an increase, but it's not going to be as dramatic as we were seeing in stage 2. And then finally in stage 4, that's where they both kind of caught up. They both sort of stabilized. They're both at relatively low levels. And just like with the first one, since they're both about the same, that's where we're going to start to see this population sort of even out. So if we were to continue, if we were to continue this graph, this would kind of represent sort of that S curve we saw in the third chapter, where we start out low, have a little bit of exponential growth, but then it starts to level off, and we get that kind of S shape there. This one's not quite as clear as we saw in the graph from the previous chapter, but if we continue this one on further, it would kind of level out. But again, with the birth rate in general, we talked about, or the population growth in general, we talked about the societal factors and things like that. We talked briefly about the food production, the resource usage, and things like that. We'll more in depth go into those aspects of it when we look at food production. We look at the different resources and things like that. But here we wanted to kind of focus on what is specifically causing the population changes that we've seen over the past, specifically like 150 years or so.